one of Star Citizen's biggest goals is delivering fully realized combined arms warfare. And currently, it is missing a fundamental part of that vision, and that is fire support assets. Now, your probably first thought is, why do we need fire support when we have planes who can do that role? And you could point to the lore, like the Battle of Idris 4 was carried by retaliator bombers. They were able to bomb Tavarans and push them back, and the hill was able to stand because these are retaliators. And that's not unlike the Air Force's original idea back when they stopped being the Air Corps, split from the Army. No matter the context of the battle that's happening, the bombers will always be able to get through. They will push back any interceptors, any ground-based air defense, and they could blow up logistical, strategic supply lines, production centers, command nodes. They could destroy any of them, no matter the situation. Yet, Korea happened, and then Vietnam happened, and the bombers were not able to get through, and both of those wars turned into entrenched slogs for the infantry, and the capability of the Air Force was limited by context of the ground battle, how far the enemy was able to suppress the ground-based defenses, how far they were able to eliminate or minimize the effectiveness of the enemy interceptors. And no one attributes any of the successes on a strategic or doctrinal level, in particular, to or the capabilities of the bombers, the outstanding successes, multi-role, or fighter jets, or the strategic bombers. And then the Gulf War happens, and every kind of analysis that came out about those, anyone who took a deep dive into it, came to the conclusion that coalition effectiveness primarily derived from the successes of their air superiority, their air power. That is true, but also at that time, Air Force's theory of the bomber will always get through no longer existed. They've changed their mission to better adapt to the context of the ongoing fight. They were performing more suppression of air defense missions. They were providing closer air support when the corridors were open to do those things. A-10, F-11s, destroying tanks, trucks, artillery, every chance that they had. And in Star Citizen is going to be different. In the lore, at the Battle of Idris 4, there's an ongoing space battle. One that the UP is losing pretty bad. Actually, that's sad. For the most part of that story, the UP is going to lose. They aren't able to really mechanized companies in the one Marine platoon on the ground. They're not able to get the reinforcements. They're not able to get them supplies or support. And these tallies, while not specifically stated, I highly doubt that they're resupplying on the ground. I don't envision that when they drew up the plans, they went, you're going to need tallies for close air support. Here are all their bombs. Here's all the fuel that you'll need. Here's all the spare parts, spare crew. And brought them to the ground and risked them losing them on a ground battle as well as losing them in the air. I fully suspect that these tallies were going back up into space, going back to their carrier supply ships, rearming, refueling, doing minor repairs, replacing crew members that can no longer function, and then flying back down into space, or back down in Idris to conduct more bombing runs. While that is impressive and something that those tally crews deserve recognition for, I believe they do have it in Thundering Horseshoes. I believe it's like Aegis recognizes that squadron, in particular at Victus. But we also have to think what happened if Tavarans had played their air defense much better. What if they had pushed, some type of short-range SAMs like the ballistas much more aggressively, pushed them with every infantry support. So when those tallies came in from space, flew in to do a bombing run, they're just unleashed dissalvo missiles at those tallies. And the tallies kept getting blown up. Every time that they got close enough to start the bombing run, they were getting shot down. The UPE would have lost that fight on the ground decisively, and the correlation of events that it was the Marine platoon made a boarding party that captured the planetary defenses that was causing this battle to be lost for the UPE. So the whole battle for Idris would have been a colossal defeat for the UPE if that tiny, tenuous corridor ever closed completely. And I bet that's something the Tavarans are slapping themselves for when they look back. Is just had a couple more ballistas, played them a bit more aggressively than we did, would have won. And there's another lore battle that I don't remember, but the name of it was a single Marine during a Vandal raid climbs into a ballista, or not a Marine, a civilian climbs into a ballista during a Vandal raid and holds off that whole raid with this ballista. So even in lore, a SAM is able to stop this close air attack. It's a prelude to a ground invasion. What if the Vandal dropped their infantry when they saw this ballista destroying all of their air assets? Add something like an M109 Paladin, a small artillery piece native to whatever ground forces they wanted, and they use that to shoot down the SAMs. They reopened that air corridor and were able to continue the raid with air assets as well as their ground forces. That should highlight probably the importance of artillery. That air corridors can close. And you do not want to be in any kind of battle where any form of your fire support is completely gone. However, if you're able to deploy your ground forces as a part of that ground assault, with your tanks, with your APCs, your ballistas, your dismounted infantry, aim a couple batteries of artillery with it, you can be far less concerned about maintaining that air corridor and those tallies, gladiators, fighters, and interceptors that you would have had to dedicate to supporting the ground offensive can now focus on the air battle, or the space battle, or even try to penetrate enemy lines, go after their supply lines, go after, if they have a production center that you want to capture, try to suppress that production center, go after the commandos if they're there. Get into position to ambush any reinforcements that they have, because the mission of fire support relegated a much smaller unit at a lower echelon of command. Additionally, another big point is that tallies are expensive, both credits, material, and personnel. 8 to 9 crewmen in the ship. It is several millions of credits to replace, and those torpedoes are tens of thousands each to fire off, whereas one artillery piece might not even pull to 1,000,000 credits. It could only be 2-man crew and a couple hundred credits a shot. They're far more expendable. You could lose them, by the dozens and not have to be nearly as concerned as when your squadron of 3 tallies is gone. Another important point is that when these large-scale battles start to happen, get realized in the game, retaliators and fighters, or any type of air asset that you could think about being used in a close air support role, from the Inferno to the Eclipse to the Tally to an Idris, if you're insane enough to use that, isn't going to be relegated to the authority of whatever ground unit you have. Your priority is going to be taking those tallies and blowing up the enemy frigates and destroyers. Fighters, you're going to want to intercept the enemy bombers before they get to your frigates and destroyers. So when your ground forces are being engaged in a way that they need to call on fire support, their commander has to go contact, whoever's leading this operation, who's probably still primarily concerned on the space battle right now. Because when you start a space battle, or start a battle for a planet, expect your enemy to keep pouring in reinforcements to push you off, push you out of that system. His primary concern is not losing the space battle and leaving his ground forces to be captured or murdered. So when your ground asset then is going to call up to him and be, I need you to divert very important retaliators you have blowing up this enemy Idris. I need them to come down here, spend tens of thousands of credits, probably die because the enemy has ballistas that we can't get to blow up the platoon of infantrymen so we can continue the fight. He's gonna say no. And if he does say yes, how long is that going to take? How long is that going to take for those tallies to come back from whatever sortie they were on? Rearm, repair, refuel, replace any crew members that they need to. Fly from space down to planet side, and then bomb whatever's holding up the infantry unit. That's going to take several minutes, and even if they were on the ground, they're going to be hundreds of kilometers away, waiting on fuel and ammo to come down. And then they have to take off. They have to fly up to your ground forces, coordinate with them at what needs to go. Identify the enemy ground force, the enemy positions, bomb them, and then fly hundreds of kilometers away, refuel and rearm, and come back. And that is adding precious minutes where seconds really do count. It'll only take 30 seconds for an enemy to get on your flank and knock out all of your armor, and you will just now have dismounted infantry at the mercy of the enemy tanks. Whereas if a commander had a native battery of artillery, so just 3 artillery pieces, 2, 3 kilometers away, that he's familiar with, that he's trained with, that are sitting on his Discord or TeamSpeak or on his little party chat, who are still aware of the ground battles going on. They're sharing information already with each other. He knows where the enemy ground forces are, or at least he knows where his forces are. He knows what the battlefield looks like. He has a general idea of coordinates, some way of rapidly targeting each area. Commander just has to call that battery, plot in a couple coordinates, and say fire, or yeah, fire, commence mission, and it's just seconds that until those shells are having effect on the battlefield, and your men aren't getting flanked, your armor's not getting knocked out, and you're able to push back the enemy, destroy their fortifications with a much cheaper asset, much closer asset, do it much faster than if you had to rely solely on tallies with a contested airspace to push through. As well as your ground forces, the scale that they're fighting on is much smaller than the space battle. A size 7 cannon, much larger in the context of trying to blow up a couple tanks and ballistas than it is trying to blow up an Idris. If you were to call down the Idris and have its railgun fire on the enemy platoon, that size 11 projectile, it's for one overkill. You're gonna eliminate your enemy quite nicely, but now you're endangering blue forces. If you had a sensitive objective that could be destroyed that you're just trying to capture, you're now endangering that, in addition to taking out an Idris, taking that out of the fight, which is going to push the space battle out of your favor. Or if it's just a couple tallies, it's still going to tip the scale out of your favor in the space battle. Size 9 torpedoes are bloody huge. It's too big, really too big to be just knocking out a couple toughened positions so your infantry can push on, or your troop of tanks can push on. Whereas an artillery piece with its size 5 artillery gun or size 7 artillery gun is going to be able to lob a shell much closer to blue forces, but it's still going to be a much smaller explosion. It's going to be contained to where the enemy is, part by just how small these projectiles are compared to a size 9 torpedo. I wouldn't suspect an artillery to be a size 9 gun. Size 7 is probably too large. Size 5 is probably the biggest, maybe size 6 at the absolute largest. That's still small enough for your men to hide behind a couple of rocks only 100 meters away instead of a kilometer away. And you're able to guide those shots much more effectively than a bombing run from a retaliator. Keep your men safe, and as well as eliminating the enemy. You're completing what needed to be happening. You're destroying the enemy, pushing them out of this objective so you can push on to, or you can carry on the fight for the rest of the day much more effectively than a retaliator is. You're endangering less blue forces, and you're doing it at a much cheaper operational cost than using tallies or any other type of air asset. And it's much safer because these air corridors are not a concern. You only have to make sure that your frontline ground forces doesn't get penetrated and endanger your rear supply where the artillery is at. But you're going to have ballistas, several ballistas overlaying. Your ground infantry is going to have rocket launchers and railguns, so your air corridor is going to be pretty tightly sealed. And then your ground forces, they're also engaging the enemy ground force. And that's going to tie them up until the point that one side crumbles, to which the back lines are then exposed. So the only real danger your artillery is in is counter battery fire from an enemy artillery, or some type of stealth maneuver or a really wide flank that your infantry and your ground forces weren't able to see due to lack of poor reconnaissance or poor situational awareness, which is then that fundamental failure goes on to your men. It's not necessarily a current capabilities gap. But for the most point of the battle, your rear lines are going to be very well secured, and it's the only way to get to them is to break front ground forces to penetrate through those lines, get to them. Having lower echelon artillery, dedicated ground artillery that can be given to lower echelon commands at the ground battle is a lot cheaper, a lot more effective, a lot safer, and a lot faster to call upon than relying specifically on close air support or artillery bombardment from space assets, as well as much more likely to happen because you're not pulling assets out of a different fight, and a very important fight as well. And of course, a lot of people still are going to say that ballistas aren't enough to stop Cass, and I don't see that. I've been in Jumptown where we've lost the air battle. We've had arrows and cutlasses and eclipses all attacking our parked ships, which were completely defenseless as we laid them up in boxes, but 2 ballistas were destroying everything because those missiles were able to destroy everything because they're much harder to detect, and those missiles can fire a lot closer than enemy missiles, and they're really, really hard to dodge from 50 to 100 meters away instead of firing from a kilometer away. And we were still able to pull out drug supplies, get the objective, extract it, even though we technically didn't have an air corridor, because we were able to deny the enemy the ability to land or engage their assets against what was effectively a defenseless ground asset at the time, just by shutting down the air corridor. But if they had an artillery system that was able to be parked far enough away that we couldn't engage it without spreading out our lines, and they could shell our SAM systems, our ballista, and effectively destroy them, then that air corridor would have been reopened and we would have lost that battle. The last major point to talk about ballistas is that artillery can effectively perform a suppression of enemy air defense mission, which is something that air assets can do as well. Would fly down with your ship where you believe SAMs are, or where SAMs are, bait them into turning on their radar, engaging your ship, firing a missile away. Then you have a second ship come in and attack the ballista and destroy it. But you're risking a pilot, you're risking an expensive ship, 2 expensive ships, 2 pilots. You might lose. There's a good chance that you're going to lose this engagement, where if you know where the SAM is, where you think the SAM could be, you fly in, you get a missile lock, you see the ballista fire, and all you have to do is evade, a missile, jump away, and then your artillery shells it. And the ballista can't fight back against the artillery, doesn't know where the artillery's at. And your artillery shells its ballista, destroys it. So now you've only risked 1 plane, successfully destroyed the enemy air defenses, so you open up your air corridor, whatever your mission needs, without risking a second plane. Or even better is if you have a ground unit, some type of Cyclone, reconnaissance version of the Cyclone, come in, or dismounted infantry, find these ballistas on their own and call in artillery to destroy them, and you never have to risk an air asset. You never have to risk that. You never have to risk anything other than a couple infantry personnel being discovered. Maybe a counter battery from enemy artillery if they have it, but then you just get into the fact that once they fire their counter battery, you can fire a counter battery back, and you just destroy each other's artillery. In which, if no one has artillery, you're in the same boat, but you also took out their SAM systems as well. So you have an open air corridor and they don't. So in the end, having an artillery piece provides many of the benefits that air support does at a much cheaper, much faster, and much safer, probably more effective measure than relying specifically on CAS or orbital strikes performed by larger ships like a Polaris or an Idris. The big concern is having CIG figure out how this targeting system works. But overall, it's not going to be the hardest thing in the world. It's been done before, and they don't need to reinvent the wheel for learning how to make a passable artillery system. It's not going to be hard to have your artillery come in and you load in all of the coordinates on this planet. You have one guy with a grid finder or a Latin long finder, and he just gets the Latin long through the scope, calls it into the artillery, and they just line up their scope with that Latin long and fire a shell. And then all they have to do is just program in projectile arcing. And that's not impossible. Something that can be done. It would make the game multiple times better when it's done. That is really all I have to say. Is that in conclusion, is that your bomber is not going to always break through. It's not always going to be able to carry the day. And having artillery, especially at lower echelons, something that can be deviated out at lower echelons, is vital. And CIG needs to add in this system and the assets so we can do that. If you enjoyed this race, or at least found it as distracting as I have, it's done by my friend Bear Commando. Link will be in his channel.